Staff Sergeant Maria Santos adjusted her rifle scope as the pre-dawn darkness began to give way to the pale light of another dangerous day in the mountains of Afghanistan. The outpost, designated Firebase Alpha 7, sat perched on a rocky ledge that overlooked three major Taliban supply routes. For 6 months, her team had been the eyes and ears of the entire region, providing overwatch for convoy operations and eliminating high-value targets that threatened American forces throughout the valley. Maria had earned her place among the elite through years of dedication and sacrifice. Growing up in East Los Angeles, she had watched her neighborhood torn apart by gang violence and poverty. Her father, a Vietnam veteran, had instilled in her the values of service and sacrifice from an early age. When she turned 18, Maria enlisted in the army with a clear goal: to become the best soldier she could be and make a difference in the world. The journey to becoming a military sniper had been brutal. The training program had a 95% failure rate, and Maria was one of only 3 women who had ever completed the course successfully. She spent months learning to read wind patterns, calculate bullet drop over impossible distances, and, most importantly, to control her breathing and heart rate in the most stressful situations imaginable. Her instructors initially doubted whether a woman could handle the physical and mental demands of the role, but Maria proved them wrong with her exceptional marksmanship and unwavering determination. Firebase Alpha 7 was her 3rd deployment, and, by far the most dangerous. The outpost was surrounded by enemy territory on 3 sides, with the only escape route being a treacherous mountain path that wound down into the valley below. The Taliban knew exactly where they were, and attacks had become increasingly frequent and sophisticated. Intelligence reports suggested that a major offensive was being planned, with the firebase as the primary target. The team consisted of 8 highly trained specialists, each with their own area of expertise. There was Captain James Rodriguez, a decorated officer who had served 4 tours in Afghanistan and knew the region better than most locals. Sergeant First Class Michael Thompson handled communications and intelligence gathering. Corporal David Kim was their demolitions expert, capable of creating or disarming any explosive device. Staff Sergeant Robert Jackson served as the team medic, though his medical skills were often overshadowed by his abilities as a close-quarters combat specialist. The remaining 3 soldiers were riflemen who provided security and support for the team's operations. Maria had developed close bonds with each member of her unit over the months they had served together. They had saved each other's lives countless times, and she trusted them with her life every single day. The isolation of their position had created a family-like atmosphere among the team, and they looked out for each other both in combat and during the long hours of waiting that characterized much of their mission. The morning of October 15th started like any other. Maria took her position in the sniper's nest, a carefully constructed hide that provided an excellent view of the surrounding terrain while keeping her concealed from enemy observation. She had spent weeks perfecting the position, adjusting the camouflage and sight lines to ensure maximum effectiveness. Her rifle, a modified M24 sniper weapon system, was perfectly zeroed and maintained with the obsessive care that separated professional snipers from amateur marksmen. Intelligence reports had indicated increased enemy activity in the area over the past week. Drone surveillance had identified several suspicious movements along the supply routes, and intercepted communications suggested that something significant was being planned. The team had been placed on high alert, with everyone maintaining constant vigilance for signs of an impending attack. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Maria spotted movement along one of the distant ridgelines. Through her scope, she could make out figures moving between the rocks, carefully staying out of sight from the main valley below. She keyed her radio and reported the contact to Captain Rodriguez, who immediately began coordinating with higher command to determine the best course of action. The figures appeared to be conducting reconnaissance of the firebase, studying the defenses and looking for weaknesses in their perimeter. Maria counted at least 12 individuals, all armed and moving with the tactical discipline that suggested they were experienced fighters rather than local militia. This was exactly the kind of threat they had been expecting, and everyone on the team understood that their position was about to become much more dangerous. Throughout the day, more enemy forces were observed moving into positions around the firebase. It became clear that they were being surrounded, with escape routes being systematically cut off by enemy fighters who knew the terrain intimately. Captain Rodriguez called for immediate extraction, but command informed him that no helicopters were available due to bad weather moving into the region. They were on their own until the storm passed and air support could reach them. As evening approached, the team prepared for what would likely be the fight of their lives. Ammunition was redistributed, defensive positions were reinforced, and everyone checked their equipment one final time. Maria cleaned her rifle and counted her rounds, making sure that every shot would count when the battle began. She had 47 rounds of match-grade ammunition, each one capable of eliminating a target at distances up to 800 meters. The first attack came just after midnight. Rocket-propelled grenades lit up the darkness as they exploded against the firebase's defensive walls. Automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple directions, creating a deadly crossfire that forced the defenders to stay low behind their fortified positions. Maria began engaging targets methodically, using the muzzle flashes from enemy weapons to locate and eliminate threats one by one. The battle raged for 6 hours, with waves of attackers throwing themselves against the firebase's defenses. Maria's rifle spoke repeatedly throughout the night, each shot carefully aimed and devastatingly effective. She accounted for 19 confirmed kills during the engagement, breaking up several assault attempts and preventing the enemy from overrunning their position. Her teammates fought with equal determination, holding their ground despite being vastly outnumbered. As dawn broke, the intensity of the attack began to diminish. The enemy had taken heavy casualties and were regrouping for what appeared to be a final assault. Maria's ammunition was running low, and she could see that several of her teammates had been wounded during the night. They needed extraction immediately, but the weather had deteriorated and visibility was near zero due to an approaching sandstorm. Captain Rodriguez made the difficult decision to call for an emergency evacuation. He knew that their position was no longer tenable and that staying would result in the loss of his entire team. The plan was simple: they would fight their way down the mountain path to a landing zone where helicopters could reach them once the storm passed. It was dangerous, but it was their only chance. The team began their tactical withdrawal just as the sandstorm reached the firebase. Visibility dropped to less than 10 feet, and the howling wind made communication nearly impossible. They moved in single file down the treacherous mountain path, with Maria providing rearguard security as they descended toward the valley floor. It was during this retreat that disaster struck. An enemy force that had been lying in wait along the escape route opened fire just as the team reached a narrow section of the path. In the chaos and confusion of the sandstorm, Maria became separated from her unit when she took up an overwatch position to cover their movement through the ambush zone. The last thing her teammates heard over the radio was Maria's voice calling out enemy positions as she engaged multiple targets simultaneously. Then, there was an explosion, followed by silence. When the storm cleared hours later and they were able to return to the area, all they found was Maria's damaged radio and blood on the rocks where she had made her last stand. For 3 days, the SEALs searched every cave, every crevice, every possible hiding place where Maria might have taken shelter. They called her name until their voices were hoarse, hoping against hope that she had somehow survived and was waiting for rescue. But there was no response, no sign of life, and eventually, they were forced to accept the devastating truth that their sister-in-arms was gone. The memorial service was held at Bagram Airfield 2 weeks later. Maria's empty boots stood at attention beside a rifle topped with her helmet, while her teammates struggled to find words to express their grief and loss. Captain Rodriguez read a letter from Maria's family, thanking the team for bringing their daughter home safely so many times before. The flag that draped her symbolic casket was folded with military precision and handed to the chaplain, who would ensure it reached her parents back in Los Angeles. What none of them knew was that at that very moment, Maria Santos was very much alive, lying in a hidden cave system 30 miles away, slowly recovering from wounds that should have killed her and planning her return to the war that everyone believed had already claimed her life. The journey through enemy territory tested every survival skill Maria had ever learned. Moving only at night and hiding during daylight hours, she made her way across 20 miles of hostile terrain while avoiding Taliban patrols that seemed to be everywhere. Her improvised equipment held together better than expected, and the crossbow proved effective for taking small game that supplemented her meager food supplies. On the second night of travel, Maria encountered her first serious obstacle. A Taliban checkpoint had been established along the main valley road, forcing her to take a much longer route through higher elevations where the risk of exposure was greater. The detour added an entire day to her journey, but it also provided an opportunity to observe enemy operations from elevated positions that offered excellent surveillance opportunities. From her vantage point high above the checkpoint, Maria could see that the Taliban forces were much better organized than intelligence reports had suggested. They had established a sophisticated communication network using handheld radios, and their weapons were newer and better maintained than the aging equipment typically associated with insurgent forces. Most concerning of all, she observed several individuals wearing what appeared to be military-style body armor and carrying advanced optical equipment. The implications were troubling. This level of organization and equipment suggested that the Taliban forces in the region were receiving significant support from external sources, possibly including foreign military advisors or weapons suppliers. The information would be crucial for military planners who were still operating under the assumption that they were dealing with local militia groups rather than a professionally trained and equipped enemy force. Maria documented everything she observed, creating detailed sketches of the checkpoint layout, personnel numbers, and equipment inventories. She noted the timing of patrol rotations and identified what appeared to be a senior commander who was directing operations from a fortified bunker position to overlook the entire valley. All of this intelligence would be invaluable to American forces planning future operations in the region. The third night brought Maria within sight of her destination. The forward operating base was larger than she had expected, with multiple helicopter landing zones and what appeared to be permanent structures rather than the temporary facilities typically associated with forward positions. Lights and activity suggested that significant numbers of personnel were stationed at the base, indicating that major operations were being planned or conducted from this location. Getting inside the base without being shot by friendly forces presented a unique challenge. Maria knew that approaching the perimeter would likely result in her being mistaken for an enemy infiltrator, especially given her disheveled appearance and lack of proper identification. She needed to find a way to identify herself as a friendly before making contact with the guards. The solution came when Maria observed a helicopter landing at the base during the pre-dawn hours. The aircraft bore the markings of a medical evacuation unit, and she could see wounded personnel being transferred to the medical facilities. If she could time her approach to coincide with the next medical evacuation, the guards would be focused on the incoming casualties rather than scanning for potential threats. Maria positioned herself near the main access road and waited for the next helicopter to arrive. When the distinctive sound of rotor blades announced an approaching aircraft, she emerged from concealment with her hands raised high above her head. The guards at the main gate initially pointed their weapons at her, but her shouted identification as an American soldier caused them to hesitate long enough for her to explain her situation. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had officially returned from the dead. The reunion with military personnel was emotional and chaotic. Word spread quickly through the base that a soldier who had been declared killed in action had somehow survived and made her way back to friendly lines. Medical personnel immediately began treating her wounds and assessing her overall condition, while intelligence officers prepared to debrief her about her experiences during the previous 2 months. The medical evaluation revealed that Maria had suffered more serious injuries than she had realized. In addition to the obvious wounds from shrapnel and her fall, she had developed a severe respiratory infection from prolonged exposure to the elements. Her body weight had dropped by nearly 30 pounds, and she showed signs of malnutrition despite her efforts to find adequate food sources. Most concerning of all, she had developed symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, though her determination to return to active duty made her reluctant to discuss the psychological impact of her ordeal. The intelligence debriefing lasted for nearly 12 hours as Maria shared everything she had observed during her time behind enemy lines. The detailed information about Taliban force strength, equipment, and organization capabilities prompted immediate revisions to operational plans that were already being implemented in the region. Her sketches of the checkpoint and surrounding terrain provided targeting information that would prove invaluable for future airstrikes and ground operations. Most importantly, Maria's intelligence revealed that the Taliban forces were planning a major offensive against American positions throughout the region. Intercepted communications and observed troop movements suggested that multiple coordinated attacks were scheduled to begin within the next 2 weeks. The forward operating base where Maria had sought shelter was actually one of the primary targets, and the enemy had been conducting detailed reconnaissance in preparation for their assault. The base commander, Colonel Patricia Williams, made the decision to accelerate planned operations against Taliban positions based on Maria's intelligence. Rather than waiting for the enemy to attack, American forces would strike first, using the element of surprise to disrupt Taliban preparations and eliminate key leadership targets. Maria's information about the checkpoint and command bunker would be crucial to the success of these preemptive operations. Despite her weakened condition, Maria volunteered to participate in the upcoming operations. Her intimate knowledge of enemy positions and tactics made her an invaluable asset, and her skills as a sniper would be needed to eliminate high-value targets that had been identified through her reconnaissance activities. Colonel Williams was initially reluctant to authorize Maria's return to combat status, but the tactical advantages of her participation ultimately outweighed the medical concerns. The first operation was scheduled for the following week, with Maria's former SEAL team being brought in specifically to work with her on eliminating the Taliban command structure she had identified. The reunion with Captain Rodriguez and the rest of her teammates was emotional beyond description. They had mourned her death and struggled with guilt over being unable to rescue her from the ambush that they believed had claimed her life. Sergeant First Class Michael Thompson broke down in tears when he saw Maria walking into the briefing room. The communications specialist had blamed himself for losing contact with her during the retreat from Firebase Alpha 7, and he had been carrying that guilt for months. Corporal David Kim, the demolitions expert, admitted that he had been having nightmares about the explosion that had separated Maria from the team, wondering if there was something he could have done differently to prevent the tragedy. Staff Sergeant Robert Jackson, the team medic, immediately began fussing over Maria's condition and insisted on personally overseeing her medical treatment. He had been the one who found her blood on the rocks after the ambush, and he had been haunted by images of what might have happened to her during her final moments. Learning that she had not only survived but had spent months gathering intelligence behind enemy lines filled him with a mixture of relief, admiration, and concern for her well-being. Captain Rodriguez struggled to find words to express his feelings about Maria's return. As the team leader, he had been responsible for the decision to retreat from Firebase Alpha 7, and he had carried the weight of losing one of his soldiers for months. The knowledge that Maria was alive and had been surviving on her own in enemy territory made him both proud of her incredible resilience and angry at himself for not finding a way to rescue her. The reunion was cut short by the urgent need to prepare for the upcoming operations. Intelligence reports indicated that Taliban forces were accelerating their own preparations, possibly in response to increased American activity in the region. The window of opportunity for preemptive strikes was closing rapidly, and every day of delay increased the risk that the enemy would be able to complete their preparations for a coordinated assault on American positions. Maria threw herself into the mission planning with an intensity that concerned her teammates and medical staff. She seemed driven by a need to prove that her survival had been worthwhile and that the intelligence she had gathered would make a significant difference in the ongoing conflict. Her detailed knowledge of enemy positions and capabilities made her an essential part of every tactical discussion, but her obvious eagerness to return to combat suggested that she had not fully processed the psychological trauma of her ordeal. The plan that emerged from these planning sessions was ambitious and dangerous. The SEAL team would conduct a series of coordinated strikes against Taliban positions, beginning with the elimination of the command bunker that Maria had identified during her reconnaissance. Follow-up operations would target supply routes, communication nodes, and weapons storage facilities that had been mapped during her months of observation. Maria's role would be to provide overwatch and precision fire support from concealed positions that took advantage of her intimate knowledge of the terrain. Her ability to navigate the area without detection would allow the team to establish firing positions that would otherwise be impossible to reach, giving them significant tactical advantages over enemy forces who believed they knew every approach route to their installations. The first mission was scheduled to begin at dawn on December 15, exactly 2 months after Maria had been declared killed in action. As she prepared her equipment and checked her weapons for what felt like the 100th time, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her back from the edge of death to this moment of preparation for one of the most important battles of her military career. What Maria didn't know was that intelligence analysts had identified her as a high-priority target for Taliban forces, who had learned of her survival and were actively hunting for the American sniper who had been gathering information about their operations. The upcoming mission would not only be an opportunity for revenge against the enemies who had tried to kill her, but also a deadly game of cat and mouse where she would be both the hunter and the hunted. The mission began before sunrise on December 15, with Maria and her SEAL team moving through the darkness toward their first objective. The Taliban command bunker sat on a strategic hilltop that overlooked 3 major valleys, making it nearly impossible to approach without being detected by enemy sentries. However, Maria's knowledge of the terrain included several hidden approaches that she had discovered during her months of observation from nearby cave systems. The team moved in complete silence, using hand signals and night vision equipment to navigate the treacherous mountain paths. Maria led the way, her intimate familiarity with every rock and crevice allowing them to avoid detection while closing in on their target. The months she had spent surviving in these mountains had taught her to move like a ghost, leaving no trace of her passage and making no sound that might alert enemy forces to their presence. As they approached the target area, Maria established an overwatch position on a rocky outcrop that provided an excellent view of the command bunker while keeping her concealed from enemy observation. Her teammates moved into assault positions, preparing to storm the bunker once she had eliminated the sentries and any other high-value targets that presented themselves during the attack. Through her rifle scope, Maria could see the Taliban commander she had observed during her reconnaissance activities. The man was standing near the bunker entrance, speaking into a handheld radio while gesturing toward the valleys below. She recognized him as the same individual who had been directing operations at the checkpoint, confirming her assessment that this location served as a central command point for enemy activities throughout the region. The shot was challenging but, well within Maria's capabilities. The target was approximately 400 meters away, positioned at a slightly elevated angle that required careful calculation of bullet drop and wind compensation. She controlled her breathing and waited for the perfect moment when the target would be stationary and clearly visible through her scope. The rifle spoke once, and the Taliban commander dropped immediately. The precision of the shot sent the enemy forces into immediate confusion as they struggled to determine where the attack was coming from. Maria's concealed position made it nearly impossible for them to identify her firing point, giving her teammates the opportunity they needed to begin their assault on the bunker. The SEAL team moved with devastating efficiency, utilizing the confusion created by Maria's sniper fire to overwhelm the enemy defenses before they could organize an effective response. Captain Rodriguez led the assault team through the bunker's main entrance, while Corporal Kim eliminated several defensive positions with carefully placed explosive charges. Within minutes, the entire facility was under American control, and valuable intelligence documents were being secured for analysis. However, the success of the first mission had an unintended consequence. Intercepted radio communications revealed that Taliban forces throughout the region now knew that an American sniper was operating in the area, and they had correctly identified her as the source of the intelligence that had enabled the surprise attack on their command center. Multiple enemy units were being redirected to hunt for the sniper, with substantial rewards offered for her capture or elimination. Maria had become the hunted, and the mountains that had provided safety during her months of hiding were now crawling with enemy forces determined to find and kill her. The Taliban leadership understood that as long as she remained operational, their ability to conduct coordinated attacks against American positions would be severely compromised. Eliminating her had become their highest priority. The second phase of the operation required the team to move to a different area of the mountains, where they would target several weapons storage facilities that Maria had identified during her reconnaissance activities. However, the increased enemy presence made movement extremely dangerous, and they were forced to take indirect routes that added days to their travel time while avoiding Taliban patrols that seemed to be everywhere. During the second night of movement, the team encountered their first serious opposition. A Taliban patrol spotted their movement across an open area and immediately called for reinforcements while engaging them with automatic weapons fire. Maria found herself in the middle of a running firefight as her teammates fought to break contact with an enemy force that seemed determined to pursue them regardless of casualties. The engagement lasted for over an hour, with both sides maneuvering for tactical advantage across the rocky terrain. Maria's sniper rifle proved decisive in breaking up several enemy assault attempts, but she was forced to expend a significant amount of her ammunition supply during the prolonged firefight. More concerning, the extended engagement had undoubtedly alerted other enemy forces to their general location, making their mission increasingly dangerous. Staff Sergeant Jackson was wounded during the firefight when shrapnel from a rocket-propelled grenade struck his left leg. The injury was not life-threatening, but it significantly reduced his mobility and forced the team to modify their movement procedures. Maria helped treat his wounds using techniques she had learned during her months of self-treatment in the caves, but she knew that the team's combat effectiveness had been reduced by the loss of their medics' full capabilities. The weapons storage facility they had targeted proved to be much more heavily defended than intelligence reports had suggested. Multiple machine gun positions covered the approaches to the site, and Maria counted at least 30 enemy fighters positioned around the perimeter. A direct assault would have been suicidal, forcing the team to develop an alternative plan that would allow them to complete their mission while minimizing casualties. Maria proposed using her knowledge of the area to establish multiple sniper positions from which she could eliminate key defensive positions before the assault team moved in. The plan required her to separate from the team and operate independently for several hours, accepting increased personal risk in order to create opportunities for mission success. Captain Rodriguez was reluctant to approve the plan, given the intelligence indicating that enemy forces were specifically hunting for her, but the tactical situation left few alternatives. The execution of the plan began at dawn on December 17, with Maria moving into position on a hillside that overlooked the weapons storage facility. From her concealed position, she had clear lines of sight to most of the enemy defensive positions, though the range was pushing the limits of her rifle's effective capabilities. The longest shot would be nearly 600 meters, requiring perfect execution under combat conditions. Maria began engaging targets systematically, starting with the machine gun positions that posed the greatest threat to her teammates during their assault. Each shot had to be perfect, as missing would alert the enemy to her position and allow them to take countermeasures that would eliminate her tactical advantage. The first target dropped cleanly, followed quickly by the second and third as she worked her way through the enemy defensive positions. However, the Taliban forces had learned from their previous encounters with Maria's sniper fire. After the third shot, smoke grenades began detonating around the facility, creating a screen that obscured her targets and made accurate shooting nearly impossible. Enemy mortar rounds began falling on the hillside around her position, forcing her to relocate before she could complete the elimination of all defensive positions. The SEAL assault team moved in despite the incomplete suppression of enemy defenses, engaging in close-quarters combat that tested their training and equipment to the limit. Corporal Kim's demolitions expertise proved crucial as he cleared several defensive positions with explosive charges, while Sergeant Thompson coordinated air support that helped tip the balance in their favor. The facility was eventually secured, but not before the team had expended most of their ammunition and sustained additional casualties. During the assault, Maria had been forced to engage enemy reinforcements that were moving toward the facility from multiple directions. Her position on the hillside provided excellent fields of fire, but also made her extremely vulnerable to counter-sniper fire from enemy marksmen who had been specifically deployed to hunt for her. Several rounds impacted the rocks near her position, indicating that her location had been identified and was being actively targeted. The successful completion of the mission came at a significant cost. In addition to Jackson's leg wound, Corporal Kim had been injured when an improvised explosive device detonated near his position during the assault on the weapons facility. The team's combat effectiveness was being steadily degraded by casualties and equipment losses, while enemy forces in the area continued to increase in number and sophistication. Intelligence reports intercepted during the mission revealed that the Taliban had brought in foreign advisors specifically to coordinate the hunt for Maria and her team. These advisors had experience fighting American Special Operations Forces and understood the tactics and techniques that made SEAL teams so effective. They were systematically closing off escape routes and establishing kill zones designed to trap the team in areas where they could be overwhelmed by superior numbers. As the team prepared for the final phase of their mission, Maria realized that they were walking into an elaborate trap. The Taliban forces had been allowing them to complete their objectives while simultaneously maneuvering to surround them in an area where extraction would be nearly impossible. The mountains that had once provided safety and concealment were becoming a prison from which there might be no escape. The climactic confrontation that Maria had been anticipating since her return from the dead was finally approaching. All of her survival skills, combat training, and intimate knowledge of the terrain would be tested in a final battle that would determine not only her own fate, but the success or failure of the entire mission. The Ghost in the Mountains was about to face her greatest challenge, and the stakes could not have been higher for both sides in this deadly game of survival. The trap was sprung on the morning of December 20th, when Maria and her team found themselves completely surrounded in a narrow valley with no apparent means of escape. Taliban forces had positioned themselves on the high ground around the valley, creating overlapping fields of fire that made movement in any direction extremely dangerous. The foreign advisors had done their work well, using the team's own success against previous targets to predict their likely routes and establish the perfect ambush site. Captain Rodriguez called for immediate extraction, but air support was unavailable due to another massive sandstorm that was approaching the region. The same weather pattern that had allowed Maria to escape during the retreat from Firebase Alpha 7 was now preventing her rescue, creating a bitter irony that was not lost on any of the team members. They were on their own, just as Maria had been during her months of survival behind enemy lines. The enemy forces began their assault with a coordinated mortar bombardment that forced the SEAL team to take cover among the rocky outcrops scattered across the valley floor. Maria counted at least 60 enemy fighters positioned around the valley rim, with more arriving throughout the morning as reinforcements were brought in from surrounding areas. The Taliban commanders were clearly determined to ensure that none of the American Special Operations soldiers would escape this time. Maria's ammunition supply was critically low, with fewer than 20 rounds remaining for her sniper rifle. Each shot would have to count, but the enemy forces had learned from their previous encounters and were being much more careful about exposing themselves to sniper fire. They moved in short rushes between covered positions, using smoke grenades and suppressive fire to mask their movements while they tightened the noose around the trapped Americans. The first casualty came when Sergeant Thompson was struck by sniper fire while attempting to establish radio contact with higher command. The communications specialist had been trying to reach any friendly forces that might be able to provide support, but his efforts had made him a priority target for enemy marksmen who understood the importance of cutting off American communications capabilities. Maria watched helplessly as her teammate fell, knowing that their situation had just become even more desperate. Corporal Kim, despite his injuries from the previous mission, volunteered to create a diversion that would allow Maria to reposition to a more advantageous firing position. The demolitions expert had identified a route that would take her to higher ground where she could provide effective overwatch for the team, but reaching that position would require her to cross an open area that was covered by multiple enemy positions. Kim's plan involved using his remaining explosive charges to create chaos among the enemy forces while Maria made her move. The diversion began with a series of controlled explosions that sent rocks and debris raining down on enemy positions along the western rim of the valley. As Taliban fighters scrambled to avoid the falling stones, Maria sprinted across the open ground toward a rocky outcrop that would provide access to the higher elevation she needed. Enemy bullets kicked up dust around her feet, but Kim's explosions had been perfectly timed to disrupt their aim at the critical moment. From her new position, Maria had a commanding view of the entire valley and the enemy forces that surrounded her teammates. She could see that the Taliban fighters were preparing for a final assault that would overwhelm the remaining Americans through sheer weight of numbers. Her rifle scope revealed the locations of enemy commanders who were coordinating the attack, providing her with priority targets that could disrupt their assault plans. The first shot eliminated a Taliban commander who was directing mortar fire against her teammates' positions. The second target was an enemy sniper who had been responsible for wounding Sergeant Thompson. Maria's third shot took out a machine gunner whose position was preventing Captain Rodriguez and the others from moving to better defensive positions. Each successful engagement bought precious time for her team, but she knew that her elevated position also made her increasingly vulnerable to counterfire. As the sandstorm reached the valley, visibility dropped dramatically and the tactical situation changed completely. The same weather conditions that had hidden Maria during her escape months earlier now provided concealment for both sides, creating a chaotic environment where friend and foe could barely distinguish between each other at distances greater than a few meters. The Taliban's numerical advantage was negated by their inability to coordinate attacks in the blinding sand and wind. Maria realized that the storm provided an opportunity for the team to escape, but only if they could reach a specific location that she remembered from her months of exploration in the area. During her time hiding in the caves, she had discovered a narrow canyon that led out of the valley through a route that was nearly impossible to detect from the surrounding high ground. The passage was treacherous and would require technical climbing skills, but it offered their only realistic chance of evading the trap that had been set for them. Communicating her plan to the team required Maria to descend from her overwatch position and rejoin her teammates in the valley. The journey through the sandstorm was harrowing, as she had to navigate by memory while avoiding both enemy fighters and the rocky obstacles that could cause fatal injuries in the limited visibility. Several times she heard voices speaking in Dari and Pashto as Taliban fighters moved past her position, searching for the American forces in the chaotic conditions. Captain Rodriguez was skeptical of Maria's escape plan when she finally reached the team's defensive position. The route she described would take them directly through areas that appeared to be heavily occupied by enemy forces, and the climbing requirements seemed beyond the capabilities of wounded team members. However, the alternatives were even less promising, and the approach of darkness would provide additional concealment for their movement through the storm. The escape began at sunset, with Maria leading her teammates through the maze of rocky terrain toward the hidden canyon entrance. Staff Sergeant Jackson, despite his leg wound, insisted on carrying Sergeant Thompson, who was unconscious and bleeding heavily from his sniper wound. Corporal Kim served as rear guard, using his remaining explosive charges to create false targets that would confuse pursuing enemy forces about their actual escape route. The narrow canyon that Maria had discovered during her months of isolation proved to be even more challenging than she had remembered. The passage required the team to climb nearly vertical rock faces while carrying their wounded teammates and essential equipment. Several times they were forced to stop and treat Thompson's worsening condition, using precious medical supplies while enemy forces searched the valley behind them. The climbing was exhausting and dangerous, particularly in the dark conditions created by the storm and the narrow confines of the canyon. Maria found herself drawing on every ounce of strength and endurance she had developed during her months of survival, pushing her body beyond its limits while helping her teammates navigate obstacles that would have been challenging even under ideal conditions. The knowledge that enemy forces were likely pursuing them through the storm provided additional motivation to keep moving despite the physical demands of the escape route. After 6 hours of climbing and crawling through the narrow canyon, the team emerged onto a high plateau that overlooked the valley where they had been trapped. The sandstorm was beginning to clear, revealing lights from enemy forces that were still searching the area where they had made their last stand. Maria's escape route had worked perfectly, allowing them to evade the trap while positioning them for extraction once air support became available. The extraction came at dawn on December 21, when a medical helicopter reached their position on the plateau. Sergeant Thompson was immediately rushed to the field hospital for emergency surgery, while the rest of the team underwent medical evaluation for their various injuries and the effects of prolonged exposure to combat stress. Maria's physical condition had deteriorated significantly during the final mission, and medical staff expressed concern about her ability to continue active duty without extended recovery time. The intelligence gathered during Maria's months behind enemy lines and the subsequent missions had provided military planners with unprecedented insight into Taliban operations in the region. The elimination of key command personnel and the destruction of weapons storage facilities had disrupted enemy capabilities for months, preventing the coordinated attacks that had been planned against American positions. Maria's survival and return had literally saved countless American lives while dealing a severe blow to enemy operations. The official after-action report credited Maria Santos with extraordinary heroism and professional competence under the most challenging conditions imaginable. Her ability to survive for months behind enemy lines while gathering crucial intelligence was unprecedented in the history of special operations. The successful completion of her final missions, despite overwhelming enemy opposition, demonstrated the highest levels of military professionalism and personal courage. 6 months later, Maria stood at attention in the Pentagon as the Secretary of Defense pinned the Medal of Honor on her uniform. The citation read in part, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty while serving as a sniper with a Navy SEAL team during combat operations against enemy forces in Afghanistan." Staff Sergeant Santos' extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty in the face of overwhelming enemy opposition reflect the highest credit upon herself, the United States Army, and the United States of America. The ceremony was attended by her former teammates, who had all recovered from their injuries and returned to active duty. Captain Rodriguez spoke about Maria's leadership and courage during the most difficult moments of their deployment, while Sergeant Thompson, who had made a full recovery from his wounds, described how her knowledge of the terrain had saved all their lives during the escape from the valley trap. Abdul Hashim, the elderly Afghan man who had shared the cave with Maria during her months of survival, was also present at the ceremony. He had successfully reached his family at the refugee camp and had been granted asylum in the United States based on his assistance to American forces. The unlikely friendship that had developed between the former teacher and the American sniper had given both of them the strength to survive their respective ordeals. Maria's story became legendary within the special operations community, serving as an inspiration for future generations of soldiers who would face similar challenges in America's ongoing conflicts around the world. Her demonstration that survival was possible even under the most desperate circumstances, and that dedication to mission and teammates could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, embodied the highest traditions of military service. The mountains of Afghanistan had tested Maria Santos beyond any limit she had previously imagined, stripping away everything except her core determination to survive and serve. She had emerged from that crucible not just as a survivor, but as a warrior whose legend would inspire others to find strength in their darkest moments. The ghost in the mountains had found her redemption in the storm, proving that sometimes the dead can indeed return to fight another day.